Hey everyone, welcome to the channel, and I'm here for an album review and rant video for you guys. Now, for this video, I'll be talking about the band All That Remains. Now, I realize All That Remains is not a band that I talk about a whole lot on this channel, and they're not exactly my favorite metalcore band, but I do think they are a good band for the most part. But they, of course, have had some iffy albums, I guess you could say, and this album is definitely one of them. So for this review and this rant, I'll be talking about The Order of Things by All That Remains. I've been thinking about talking about this album for a bit now, so I figured that, hey, why not just talk about the album now. Whenever I first listened to this album, I will admit I was pleasantly surprised. Now, I say pleasantly surprised because obviously there was a time where I actually enjoyed this album. Believe it or not, whenever I first listened to this album, I've actually enjoyed it at first listen. And I think the reason for that is because, well, this came out in around 2015, and around this time, that's when I was heavily into this kind of metal, this sort of radio-friendly, mainstream sounding metal, this more accessible sounding modern metal. That was kind of up my alley at this time. So that's kind of why I liked this album at first listen, because 2015, I was still pretty new to metal, of course. So that is whenever I first heard this album, and yeah, of course I liked it. And I remember thinking that it was also very different from what I have heard from All That Remains before, because before hearing this album, I've heard some songs from The Fall of Ideals and Overcome, some songs from their previous albums, and even to longtime All That Remains fans, I'm sure this was definitely different for a lot of people, and it definitely is. It's a very different album for All That Remains. They did not go exactly in the best direction, you could say. Now, this is one of All That Remains' weakest albums. In my opinion, it's the second to weakest. I think their weakest is Madness, but this album is definitely not one of their best. Now, this album starts off with This Probably Won't End Well, which is the opening track, and what do I think of this one? I think it's a decent song. I think Phil's clean vocals are pretty good in this song. I mean, it's not a song that's mind-blowing or anything, but it's alright. Now, when it comes to Phil Lamonte's clean vocals, I think he's got an alright singing voice. Now, I've definitely heard better clean vocalists in metalcore, but Phil, he's decent. And this song, This Probably Won't End Well, is very radio-friendly, very mainstream. Pretty accessible track. I mean, if you're someone who's into bands like Breaking Benjamin or 3 Days Grace and you're trying to get into metal or metalcore or whatever, I think that this would be a pretty accessible song for those people. You would probably have an easier time getting into albums like The Order of Things than you do a lot of the previous All That Remains albums. Now, it's a decent song. I mean, it's not that memorable, but it's alright. And then we got No Knock, which is maybe my favorite song on the album. I don't know. Of course, it is the heaviest song on the album. It starts off with these really intense riffs that kind of sound like they could be placed in the middle part of a metalcore song as a breakdown. So that's kind of interesting. But these intense riffs are what start the song, and it goes right into some aggressive vocals, of course. The lyrics are interesting, and it's a pretty heavy track. I actually like this one. Now, it's not mind-blowing or anything. There's not really anything off this album that I would consider mind-blowing, but this is a pretty good song overall. And then we got Divide, which is another more radio-friendly, mainstream-sounding song. It's kind of got a upbeat feel to it, I guess. This song kind of reminds me of a Skillet song, if I'm being honest. I mean, I remember at first listen, I remember thinking, wow, this reminds me a lot of Skillet. And yeah, it's got Skillet written all over it pretty much. It's kind of edgy. It's, you know, got its energy to it. It's kind of got that vibe to it. It's not terrible, but it's not great either. So, Divide, it's just a mass song for me. It, again, reminds me of Skillet. But, of course, we got to talk about the song For You, which is one of the worst All That Remains songs. Honestly, I think it is. I think it's one of the worst All That Remains songs. It's incredibly cheesy. It's like this ballad that, like, tries to be, like, so accessible for people that aren't into metal. It's like, I don't know who they're trying to cater to with this album, but I know I've heard somewhere where Phil said that they like transcended metal with this album or whatever, which that just leaves me speechless. Like, absolutely not. This album is not, you know, a transition to metal or whatever, like transcending metal, I should say. I mean, definitely not. It's just not very good. This song in particular is just not that good. It's incredibly cheesy. I'm not a fan of it, and I think it's one of All That Remains' worst songs. And it's just kind of another mass song. It's just not very good. Now, there's not really much else to talk about on this album, because this album does not have many memorable tracks. So I'm not going to go over everything from this album, because this album just doesn't have many memorable songs, and that's my problem with this album. It's not memorable, and it's also pretty cheesy at times, like I said with the song For You. Because I know some people might say, oh, Zach, you don't like it just because it's not heavy All That Remains. But it's more than just that, okay? It's that these songs are just also not memorable. Now, yes, I will admit that I do like All That Remains' more heavier side than their more radio-friendly, mainstream-sounding side, but even, like, albums like this just show that, like, they're not as good at doing them. You know, now there's some bands that can get away with doing some mainstream stuff like this, but All That Remains is just not the band for that. Now, thankfully, with the latest release, Victim of the New Disease, they do seem to head back in the right direction with that album. So I will give them credit for that, because that album's actually pretty good. But with this album, The Order of Things, it's not very good. And, you know, I'm so sick of hearing people say, oh, Zach, bands evolve, bands evolve. Didn't you hear the saying? Bands evolve. Bands evolve. They don't go to crap like this. You know, this is not evolving. This is more like low-key selling out in a way. Following a trend. Like, they were trying to follow this trend where, oh, we got to have more singing. We got to stray away from what made us good in the first place. The band In Flames is also guilty of this. I just don't get these people that say bands evolve. Because honestly, what band do you know has actually gotten better over time? Because the way I see it, most bands' older material is usually better than their new material. That is just the case with most bands. I know that maybe some people might be in denial about that, but it's true. It's just a fact that most bands' previous material is better. I don't know many bands where I say that I like their new stuff more. There's not many bands where I can really say that to. Now, sure, there are bands that have put out great albums that are some of their recent material, but I'm just talking about them not being as good, or they reach the same heights in terms of quality as the previous material. That's all I'm trying to say here. All That Remains, I mean, it's clear as... They're one of those bands where it's clear as day that their old stuff is just better. You know what I'm saying? I mean, they took a mainstream direction with this album. Like, I can't stand when these metalcore bands do this. Like with this album, it does seem like All That Remains is trying to bring in the Breaking Benjamin fans. They're trying to bring in the 3 Days Grace fans. They're trying to bring in the fans of Skillet, Shinedown, Seether, all those hard rock bands, you know, and I hate when bands do that, you know, like, it especially doesn't work for All That Remains. So, even with that said, this album is not that memorable, especially with a lot of the songs in the second half. I honestly don't remember much as far as the second half of this album. It's kind of bland, mediocre, and it's just not very good. So this album, if I were to give this album a score, I'll have to give it a 2 out of 10. So I'm done here. That is my review for All That Remains, The Order of Things. It's a pretty weak album. It is one of their weakest albums. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day and take care.